Upon hearing the cleaner play the violin, the millionaire froze as he recognized the music. The same his wife used to play before disappearing 20 years ago. Richard Thompson stood at the large bay window of his mansion, watching the autumn leaves fall lazily to the ground. The estate, nestled in the outskirts of New York, was a picture of wealth and grandeur. But inside, the house was eerily quiet, its air thick with an unshakable sense of melancholy. Every corner seemed frozen in time, as if holding its breath, waiting for a moment that would never come. The grand piano in the parlor had not been touched in years. The dining room, with its ornate chandelier, had not seen a lively dinner party in decades. Even the walls, adorned with framed photographs of happier times, seemed to stare back at Richard with quiet reproach. Among those photos, one stood out, a candid shot of Emily, his wife, holding a violin with her signature smile, the same violin that now gathered dust in the forgotten depths of the mansion's basement. It had been 20 years since Emily disappeared without a trace. 20 long years of unanswered questions, false leads, and sleepless nights. Though Richard had long stopped actively searching, he never let go of the hope that somehow, somewhere, Emily might still be alive. Lately, his solitude had been interrupted by the arrival of Samantha Miller, a young woman hired to help with the cleaning. She had a fresh energy about her, the kind that momentarily broke through the somber atmosphere of the mansion. Samantha had started working only a few weeks ago, and while she kept mostly to herself, Richard couldn't help but notice her curiosity about the house. On this particular day, Samantha found herself in the basement, sorting through the mountain of forgotten objects that had accumulated over the years. The air was cold, and the dim light from a single bulb cast long shadows across the cluttered room. Among the boxes of old books and furniture, her eyes landed on a worn violin case tucked behind a stack of crates. She wiped the dust off the case and opened it carefully. The violin inside was a masterpiece, its wood still gleaming despite the years of neglect. Samantha ran her fingers over the strings, testing their tension. Without thinking, she brought it to her shoulder and began to play. The melody that came to her was hauntingly familiar. Though she couldn't place where she had heard it before, it seemed to flow from her fingertips, as if it had always been a part of her. Upstairs, Richard was sitting in his study, engrossed in paperwork. When the faint strains of music reached his ears, he froze, his pen hovering above the page. The melody was unmistakable. It was Emily's song, a piece she had composed herself and played with such grace that it had become her signature. No one else knew it. No one else could play it like that. His heart pounded as he followed the sound down the hall and into the basement. He stopped at the doorway, his breath catching at the sight of Samantha. She stood with her back to him, eyes closed, completely absorbed in the music. The violin seemed to come alive in her hands, filling the cold, lifeless space with warmth and emotion. When the last note lingered in the air, Samantha opened her eyes and turned to see Richard standing there, his face pale and his eyes glistening with tears. "Who taught you that song?" he asked, his voice trembling, startled. Samantha lowered the violin. "No one," she replied honestly. "I've always known it. I don't even remember when I first played it. It just feels like something I've always carried with me." Richard stared at her, his mind racing. The melody, the way she played it, it was too perfect, too exact to be a coincidence. His thoughts spiraled, memories of Emily flooding back with every beat of his racing heart. "I need to know more," he said, his voice steadying. "Where did you learn to play the violin?" Samantha hesitated. "I grew up in an orphanage. The violin was always there. I think it was a gift from someone when I was very young. It's always been with me, though I never knew why." The weight of her words hit Richard like a wave. His chest tightened as he tried to make sense of what he had just witnessed. Could this young woman, with her inexplicable connection to Emily's song, hold the key to the mystery that had haunted him for 2 decades? Richard's gaze drifted back to the violin in Samantha's hands. Something stirred deep within him, a glimmer of hope he hadn't felt in years. He didn't know how, but he was certain of one thing. This was only the beginning. Samantha could feel Richard's eyes lingering on her as she stood awkwardly with the violin in her hands. The weight of his gaze was unsettling, and the sudden tension in the room was impossible to ignore. She shifted uncomfortably, unsure of what she had done to provoke such a strong reaction. "I didn't mean to upset you," she said quietly, lowering the violin to her side. "I was just curious." Richard took a deep breath, trying to compose himself. His emotions were a tempest. Shock, disbelief, and a faint, desperate hope all swirling together. "You didn't upset me," he said, though his voice betrayed the turmoil he felt. "It's just that song. No one else knows it. No one else could play it like that." Samantha tilted her head, confused. "It's always been in my head," she said. "I can't explain it. I've played it for as long as I can remember." Richard's mind raced as he tried to piece together the improbable puzzle before him. The melody was unmistakable. Emily's melody. He had watched her compose it on that very violin, her fingers delicately crafting each note. The thought of anyone else knowing it, let alone playing it so perfectly, was unthinkable. "Where did you get the violin?" he asked, his voice soft but insistent. Samantha hesitated, feeling the weight of the moment. "I've had it since I was a child. It was one of the only things I had when I was brought to the orphanage. I don't know where it came from." Her words hung in the air, sinking into Richard like stones. An orphanage, a childhood shrouded in mystery, the violin, Emily's melody. None of it made sense. And yet, it all felt connected in a way he couldn't yet explain. "Can I see it?" he asked, gesturing toward the violin. Samantha hesitated, but ultimately handed it to him. Richard took it carefully, his hands trembling as he examined the instrument. It was undeniably Emily's. He traced the delicate engraving on the neck, a pattern of ivy leaves she had chosen herself. The varnish had dulled over the years, but the craftsmanship was unmistakable. "This violin belonged to my wife," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She disappeared 20 years ago." Samantha's eyes widened. I didn't know," she said, her voice filled with both confusion and sympathy. "I didn't mean to intrude." "You didn't," Richard said quickly, shaking his head. "You couldn't have known." The air between them grew heavy with unspoken questions. Samantha wanted to ask more about Emily, about the connection she felt to this mysterious woman she had never met. But she sensed that Richard needed a moment to process what was unfolding. "I'll put it back," she offered, reaching for the violin. "No," Richard said, holding it tightly. "Keep it. Play it whenever you want. Just don't stop playing." His words surprised her, but she nodded, sensing the importance of the request. She placed the violin back in its case and excused herself, leaving Richard alone in the basement. He stood there for a long time, staring at the instrument as memories of Emily flooded his mind. Upstairs, Samantha sat in the small room she had been given as part of her job. It was modest but cozy, a stark contrast to the grandeur of the mansion. She couldn't shake the look in Richard's eyes when he had heard her playing. It wasn't just recognition. It was something deeper, a kind of pain she couldn't fully understand. Her thoughts drifted back to the orphanage in Chicago, where she had spent most of her childhood. The violin had always been her escape, a way to express the emotions she couldn't put into words. She had never questioned where it came from, or why the melody felt so natural to her. It had simply been a part of her for as long as she could remember. Back in his study, Richard poured himself a glass of scotch, his hands still trembling. He couldn't ignore the uncanny connection between Samantha and Emily. It was more than just the melody. It was the way Samantha played, the way she held the violin with the same grace Emily had. The resemblance was haunting. Unable to focus, Richard pulled out an old photo album from his desk drawer. Flipping through the pages, he found a picture of Emily holding the violin, her smile radiating warmth. He studied the image, searching for answers in the face that had been etched into his memory for 2 decades. That night, as the mansion fell silent once again, Richard lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The melody echoed in his mind, refusing to let him rest. He knew he couldn't ignore the questions that were piling up. Who was Samantha? How had she come to possess Emily's violin? And, most importantly, could this be a sign that Emily was still out there somewhere? Meanwhile, Samantha lay in her own bed, the events of the day replaying in her mind. She felt a strange pull toward Richard and his story, as though her own past was intertwined with his in ways she couldn't yet comprehend. In the darkness of the mansion, 2 restless souls grappled with the same melody, each feeling its pull but unsure of where it would lead. Richard sat in his study, staring at the photo of Emily holding the violin. The edges of the picture had yellowed with age, and faint fingerprints dotted the glossy surface. He traced the image with his thumb, his heart heavy with longing. It had been 2 decades since she vanished, and yet, moments like this made it feel like yesterday. Closing the album, he leaned back in his chair and let his thoughts drift to the last time he had seen her. The memory was both vivid and painful, as if etched into his mind with a blade. It was a warm summer evening, and the sun had just dipped below the horizon. Emily had been in the garden, her laughter carrying through the air like a melody. She had called to him, urging him to join her, but he had been too preoccupied with work. "If I could turn back time," Richard whispered to himself. His voice breaking, the memory gave way to the chaos of the night she disappeared. They had been driving back from a weekend getaway, a rare break from their busy lives. The roads were slick from a sudden rainstorm, and the air was thick with tension. A truck swerved into their lane, and everything after that was a blur. Richard woke up in the hospital with a fractured rib and a head injury. Emily, they told him, had been thrown from the car. Despite endless searches and investigations, no trace of her was ever found. The lack of closure haunted Richard, leaving a void that no amount of time or money could fill. He had built his wealth on determination and precision. But the disappearance of his wife was the one problem he could never solve. Now, Samantha's presence in his home was stirring emotions he thought he had buried long ago. The way she played the violin, her connection to the melody, it all felt too coincidental. There was something about her that he couldn't shake, and he knew he had to dig deeper. The next morning, Samantha found herself avoiding Richard's gaze. She wasn't sure why the encounter in the basement had unsettled her so much. It wasn't just his reaction to the melody. It was the way he looked at her, as though searching for something he desperately needed to find. As she dusted the shelves in the library, her eyes landed on a row of leather-bound journals. Curious, she pulled one out and flipped through its pages. The handwriting was neat and deliberate, the words chronicling years of Richard's life. One entry caught her attention. "It's been a year since Emily disappeared. Every night, I wake up expecting to see her beside me. And every night, the emptiness of the bed is a cruel reminder that she's gone. I don't know how to keep going without her." Samantha closed the journal, her heart aching for the man who had written those words. She felt a strange connection to Richard's pain, though she couldn't explain why. Later that day, Richard approached her as she was arranging flowers in the dining room. "Samantha," he began, his tone softer than she expected. "Can we talk?" She nodded, setting the vase aside. "Of course." He gestured for her to sit at the long dining table. "I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll be honest with me." "I'll try," she said, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "You said you grew up in an orphanage," Richard said. "Do you know anything about your parents? Anything at all?" Samantha hesitated, the familiar ache of not knowing resurfacing. "No," she admitted. "I was found as a baby, left outside a hospital in Chicago. They told me I had nothing with me except the violin." Richard leaned forward, his expression intense. "Do you still have it, the violin?" "Yes," she said. "It's in my room. Would you mind if I took a closer look?" Samantha nodded, sensing the importance of the request. She retrieved the violin and handed it to him, watching as he inspected it carefully. Richard's hands trembled as he found the engraving on the neck, the same ivy leaf pattern he had traced so many times before. There was no doubt in his mind. This was Emily's violin. "How is this possible?" he murmured, more to himself than to Samantha. "What do you mean?" she asked, her curiosity growing. "This violin belonged to my wife," he said, his voice barely audible. "It disappeared with her the night of the accident." Samantha's breath caught. You think it's connected to me somehow?" "I don't know," Richard admitted. "But I'm going to find out." The weight of his words lingered in the air, leaving Samantha with more questions than answers. As Richard walked away, the violin still in his hands, she couldn't help but feel that her past was about to collide with his in ways neither of them could predict that night. As the mansion settled into its usual quiet, both Richard and Samantha lay awake, their minds racing. For Richard, it was the hope that he might finally uncover the truth about Emily. For Samantha, it was the unsettling possibility that the answers to her own identity might lie within the walls of this house. The morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the mansion, illuminating the faint specks of dust that danced in the air. Richard sat in his study, the violin resting on his desk like a piece of a long-lost puzzle. He stared at it for what felt like hours, his mind oscillating between disbelief and determination. The engraving on the neck of the violin was unmistakable. It was Emily's. He couldn't ignore the connection anymore. Samantha's presence, her talent, and now this violin. It all pointed to something deeper, something he had to uncover. Picking up the phone, he dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Detective Collins," a gruff voice answered on the other end. "Collins, it's Richard Thompson," he said, his voice steady. "I need your help." There was a pause before Collins responded. "It's been a while, Richard. What's this about?" "It's about Emily," Richard said, gripping the edge of his desk. "I think I've found something, or someone." Collins didn't need further explanation. "I'll be there this afternoon." Meanwhile, Samantha busied herself in the library, trying to distract her racing thoughts with work. Her mind kept circling back to Richard's words the day before. "This violin belonged to my wife. How could that be possible?" The violin had been with her for as long as she could remember, a silent companion through her lonely years at the orphanage. Curiosity gnawed at her. She knew there was something Richard wasn't telling her, something tied to the mysterious Emily and her disappearance. While dusting the shelves, Samantha's hand brushed against a stack of old papers tucked into a corner. The faded edges and musty smell hinted at their age. Pulling them out, she discovered they were old letters, tied together with a frayed ribbon. The top letter caught her eye. Emily's name was scrawled in elegant handwriting across the envelope. Her heart raced as she debated whether to open it. Was it her place to read them? Before she could decide, she heard footsteps approaching. Richard appeared in the doorway, his face a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. "Samantha," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Do you have a moment?" She quickly tucked the letters back onto the shelf, smoothing her hands on her apron. "Of course." He stepped into the room, glancing around before his gaze settled on her. "There's something I need to tell you, and I need you to be honest with me about what you remember from your past." Samantha's stomach tightened. She nodded, waiting for him to continue. "For 20 years ago, my wife, Emily, disappeared after a car accident," Richard began, his tone heavy with emotion. "No trace of her was ever found, but I never stopped looking. And now you show up with her violin and play her melody as if it's a part of you." Samantha felt a lump form in her throat. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "I've always had the violin, but I don't remember where it came from. It was just there, as far back as I can remember." Richard studied her closely, his eyes searching for answers she didn't have. "I've hired a private investigator to look into this," he said finally. "I hope you don't mind." Her initial instinct was to protest, to tell him it wasn't necessary, but deep down, a part of her wanted answers as much as he did. "I understand," she said quietly. "Thank you," Richard replied, his voice softening. "I know this must be overwhelming, but I feel like we're on the brink of something important." That afternoon, Detective Collins arrived, his grizzled appearance a stark contrast to the opulence of the mansion. He greeted Richard with a firm handshake and a nod, his sharp eyes immediately taking in the surroundings. "Let's get to it," Collins said, pulling out a notepad. "What am I working with?" Richard explained everything. Emily's disappearance, Samantha's arrival, the violin, and the melody. Collins listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. When Richard finished, the detective leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Sounds like we're dealing with a lot of coincidences," Collins said. "But coincidences have a way of leading to answers." Richard handed him a folder containing old case files, photos, and newspaper clippings from the time of Emily's disappearance. "This is everything I have," he said. "But it's been 20 years. I need fresh eyes on this." Collins nodded. "I'll start with Samantha," he said. "If she was left at an orphanage as a baby, there might be records we can trace. And if that violin is truly Emily's, we'll figure out how it got to her." While the detective worked, Richard found himself pacing the mansion, his thoughts a whirlwind of hope and fear. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the verge of discovering something monumental, something that could finally bring him closure or shatter him completely. In her room, Samantha sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the violin case. She couldn't remember a time when it wasn't a part of her life, but now, it felt like a stranger. The connection to Emily, to Richard, was undeniable. But what did it mean for her? As the day gave way to evening, the mansion once again fell into its familiar quiet. But this time, the silence felt charged, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the truth to emerge. The sound of Samantha's steady footsteps echoed softly in the vast hallways of the mansion. She had spent the entire morning avoiding Richard, after their conversation the day before and the arrival of the detective. She felt a growing unease, questions about her past, about the violin, and now about Emily swirled in her mind like an unstoppable storm. Finally, she retreated to her room, seeking refuge from the weight of it all. The violin sat on the small table by the window, its polished surface gleaming in the midday sun. Samantha stared at it, her thoughts pulling her back to the orphanage where she had spent her childhood. She remembered the day she first discovered her love for music. It had been a gray afternoon, and the staff had brought in a collection of donated items for the children to sort through, amid the piles of clothes and books. A small violin had caught her eye. Its strings were broken, and the varnish was chipped. But to her, it was beautiful. "I think it's broken," one of the older boys had teased, laughing as Samantha picked it up. "Then I'll fix it," she had replied defiantly, clutching the violin to her chest. With the help of one of the orphanage's volunteers, she learned how to restring and tune it. From the moment she played her first note, it was as if a door had opened to a world she never knew existed. Music became her escape, her way of expressing feelings she didn't have words for. And that melody, the one Richard recognized as Emily's, had been with her from the very beginning. Samantha shook herself from the memory and picked up the violin, holding it as she had so many times before. Her fingers instinctively moved across the strings, and the familiar tune filled the room. The melody always brought her a sense of comfort, but now it carried a weight she couldn't ignore. A knock at the door startled her. She placed the violin down and opened the door to find Detective Collins standing there, his notepad in hand. "Mind if we talk?" he asked, his tone gruff but not unkind. Samantha stepped aside, letting him into the room. He glanced around briefly before settling his gaze on her. "I've been looking into your story," Collins began, flipping through his notes. "You said you were left at a hospital in Chicago as a baby. Do you remember anything about who brought you there, or how you ended up at the orphanage?" Samantha shook her head. "I was too young to remember. The staff at the orphanage told me I was found in a basket with nothing but the violin and a blanket." Collins scribbled something in his notebook. "Did anyone ever come looking for you? Any visitors? Letters? Anything unusual?" "No," Samantha said quietly. "I used to dream about it, though, that someone would come and take me home." The detective's eyes softened for a moment before he nodded. "The hospital records from that time are spotty, but I'll see what I can dig up. If this violin really belonged to Emily Thompson, then finding out how it ended up with you is the key to understanding all of this." After he left, Samantha sat by the window, watching the trees sway in the breeze. Her mind drifted back to her childhood once again, to the nights she spent staring out at the stars, wondering if her parents were out there somewhere. Thinking of her, she had always believed her story was simple, an orphan without a past. But now, pieces of a puzzle she didn't know existed were falling into place, and it scared her downstairs. Richard was in the study, pacing as Collins briefed him on his findings so far. "It's still early, but there's definitely something unusual about Samantha's history," the detective said. "The hospital records are incomplete, but the timeline matches up with the night of the accident." Richard's heart raced. "And the violin," Collins nodded. "It's highly unlikely that it's a coincidence. We'll need more evidence. But I think Samantha might be connected to Emily in ways none of us expected." The words hung heavy in the air. Richard turned toward the window, his thoughts swirling. If Samantha truly was tied to Emily, then what did it mean for the mystery of her disappearance? As night fell, Samantha wandered into the garden, hoping the fresh air would clear her mind. She found herself drawn to a stone bench beneath a sprawling oak tree. Sitting there, she stared up at the stars, their light flickering faintly in the dark sky. She thought about Richard, about Emily, and about the violin that had been her constant companion. For the first time, She wondered if the melody that had always felt so deeply personal to her might actually belong to someone else. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faintest whisper of something she couldn't quite place. Samantha closed her eyes, her hand resting on the violin at her side. Unbeknownst to her, Richard stood at the edge of the garden, watching her silhouette against the backdrop of the night. He couldn't shake the feeling that Samantha was the missing piece of a puzzle he had spent 20 years trying to solve. "Emily," he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible. "Where are you?" The mansion was quiet, as Samantha made her way down to the basement. She had avoided the room ever since the day she first played the violin there, but something inside her pulled her back. Maybe it was the unanswered questions swirling around her, or maybe it was the faint hope that she might uncover something, anything, that could make sense of the strange connection between her, Richard, and the violin. The air in the basement was cool and heavy, filled with the faint scent of dust and aged wood. The single bulb above flickered slightly, casting long shadows across the cluttered room. Samantha hesitated at the bottom of the stairs, her eyes scanning the piles of boxes, furniture, and forgotten relics that surrounded her. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for, but she felt an almost instinctual urge to dig deeper into the remnants of this house's past. Her fingers brushed over a stack of old books, a tarnished lamp, and a small wooden chest with a rusted latch. It wasn't until she moved aside a stack of crates that her attention was caught by a large, leather-bound trunk. It was tucked into the farthest corner of the room, almost hidden behind a heavy cabinet. The leather was cracked and worn, and the brass clasps were tarnished with age. Samantha knelt down and tried to lift the lid, but it didn't budge. A small lock held it shut. Frustrated but undeterred, she looked around for something to break the lock. Her eyes landed on an old crowbar leaning against the wall. She hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should proceed, but her curiosity won out. Positioning the crowbar against the lock, she gave it a sharp tug. The lock snapped open with a loud clang. Taking a deep breath, Samantha lifted the lid. Inside, the trunk was filled with an assortment of items: faded photographs, handwritten letters, and a stack of journals with their edges frayed. She carefully picked up the top photograph and froze. It was a picture of Emily. Samantha recognized her immediately from the portrait that hung in Richard's study. In the photograph, Emily stood in a sunlit garden, the same violin cradled in her arms. Her smile was warm and full of life. But what struck Samantha most was a strange sense of familiarity. It wasn't just the resemblance. It was something deeper, something she couldn't quite explain. Her hands trembled as she reached for one of the journals. The first few pages were filled with elegant handwriting, describing moments of joy and love. Samantha's eyes scanned the words, her heart pounding as she realized these were Emily's journals. She flipped through the pages, her breath catching at the mentions of the violin, the melody, and her life with Richard. But then, near the middle of the journal, the tone shifted. The entries became shorter, filled with worry and uncertainty. One entry in particular made Samantha pause. "The melody has always been a part of me. Now it's a part of her too. I don't know if Richard understands how much it means to me, how much of myself I've poured into it. It's not just music. It's a connection, a thread that ties us together, if anything were to happen." Samantha closed the journal, her mind racing. The words seemed to confirm what Richard had told her. The melody was deeply personal to Emily, and now it was somehow connected to Samantha as well. But how? She carefully gathered the journals and photographs, her mind made up to show them to Richard. As she ascended the stairs, the weight of her discovery pressed heavily on her. She had no idea what these relics would reveal, but she knew they were important. When she entered the study, Richard looked up from his desk, his expression softening when he saw the stack of items in her arms. "What's all this?" he asked, rising to meet her. "I found them in the basement," Samantha said, setting the journals and photographs on the desk. "I think they belong to Emily." Richard's eyes widened as he reached for the photograph on top. He stared at it for a long moment, his fingers tracing the image as if it could bring Emily back to him. "This was taken the summer before she disappeared," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She loved that garden." Samantha watched as he carefully opened one of the journals, his eyes scanning the familiar handwriting. For a moment, it was as if the years had melted away, and Emily was right there with him. "Did you read these?" he asked, glancing up at her. Some of it, Samantha admitted. There's a lot about the melody, about how much it meant to her, I thought. Maybe it could help us figure things out. Richard nodded, his gaze returning to the journals. Thank you for bringing these to me, he said softly. They might hold answers we've been searching for. As the evening wore on, Richard and Samantha combed through the journals together. Each entry painted a vivid picture of Emily's life, her passions, and her fears. They discovered mentions of the violin's origins, Emily's love for music, and even her struggles with the pressures of their life before the accident. But one entry stood out among the rest. It was dated just a week before the accident and read, "I feel like something is about to change. I don't know why, but I can't shake the feeling. I hope I'm wrong, but if anything happens to me, I need to make sure she's safe. She's my everything." The word sent a chill through Richard. He leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Who was she talking about? He murmured, almost to himself. Samantha didn't answer, but a thought crept into her mind, one that she wasn't ready to voice. Could Emily have been talking about her? The air in the study was heavy with unspoken questions. As Richard and Samantha sat in silence, the journals and photographs scattered across the desk. The words they had read echoed in their minds, each sentence revealing a fragment of Emily's thoughts and feelings. For Richard, it was as though he were hearing Emily's voice again after 20 long years. For Samantha, it was like uncovering a connection to someone she had never met, but somehow felt inexplicably tied to. Richard's eyes lingered on the last journal entry, the one that hinted at a profound secret Emily had been carrying. The phrase, "She's my everything," repeated in his mind like a refrain. It didn't make sense, and yet it felt like the key to everything. "Do you think she was talking about me?" Samantha finally asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was hesitant, as if she didn't quite believe her own words. Richard looked up at her, his expression a mix of doubt and hope. "I don't know," he admitted, "but the timing, the violin, the melody, it's all too much to ignore." Samantha leaned back in her chair, running her fingers through her hair. "If she was talking about me, then why was I left at an orphanage? Why didn't she keep me safe like she said?" Richard had no answer. The idea of Emily being connected to Samantha in such a profound way was overwhelming, but it raised more questions than answers. If Samantha truly was tied to Emily, then why hadn't she ever surfaced during the investigations? Why had the violin, the melody, and now Samantha herself reappeared after all these years? Just as Richard was about to speak, there was a knock at the door. Detective Collins stepped inside, a folder in his hand and a serious expression on his face. "I've got some updates," he said, glancing between Richard and Samantha. "And I think you're going to want to hear this." Richard gestured for him to sit, his pulse quickening. Collins took a seat and opened the folder, pulling out a stack of papers. "I've been looking into Samantha's history," he began. "The records from the orphanage are sparse, but I managed to piece together a timeline." Samantha leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "What did you find?" Collins adjusted his glasses, his tone measured. "You were left at the hospital in Chicago 20 years ago, just a few days after the accident that took Emily. There were no identifying details. No name, no birth certificate, just a basket, a blanket, and the violin." Richard's breath caught. "The same violin," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Collins nodded. "Yes, and here's where it gets interesting. I pulled the police reports from the accident. There was a witness, a woman who stopped to help before the authorities arrived. She described seeing a baby being carried from the wreckage by another woman." Richard's heart pounded. "What? Another woman? Who was she?" "That's the thing," Collins said. "The witness didn't recognize her, and there was no follow-up. But if Emily survived the crash and somehow got separated from the baby, Samantha, it could explain a lot." Samantha felt like the air had been knocked out of her lungs. "You're saying Emily, my mother, might have left me there?" "It's a possibility," Collins said gently. "But it's also possible she thought she was protecting you. Maybe she believed she couldn't keep you safe." The room fell silent as the weight of his words sank in. Richard stared at the papers on the desk, his mind racing with the implications. If Emily had survived, then why hadn't she returned? And why had she left Samantha behind? Collins cleared his throat. "There's one more thing," he said, pulling out a grainy photograph from the folder. "I managed to track down the hospital staff who were working the night Samantha was left there. One of them remembered a woman who fit Emily's description. She was disoriented, possibly injured, and she insisted the baby be taken care of before disappearing." Richard's hands trembled as he took the photograph. It was blurry, but there was no mistaking the figure in the image. It was Emily. "That's her," he said, his voice breaking. "She was there." Samantha's eyes filled with tears as she looked at the photo. For the first time, she felt a flicker of hope, a connection to a past she had never known. "She didn't abandon me," she whispered. "She tried to protect me." Richard reached across the table, placing a comforting hand on hers. "We're going to find her," he said firmly. "Whatever it takes, we'll bring her back." Collins nodded. "I've already started looking into the areas where she might have gone after the hospital. There's a lead that points to a small town in Vermont. I'll follow up on it and keep you updated." As the detective left, Samantha and Richard remained seated, the photograph still resting between them. The room was filled with a mix of emotions: relief, hope, and a lingering sense of uncertainty. They were closer to the truth than ever before. But the journey was far from over that night. As Samantha lay in bed, she clutched the photograph tightly. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of clarity about her past, but with it came a flood of new questions. What had happened to Emily after that night? And why had it taken 20 years for their paths to cross again? In his study, Richard sat staring at the violin. The thought of Emily being alive, of her having been so close yet so far, was almost too much to bear. But beneath the fear and doubt, there was a spark of determination. He had lost her once, and he wouldn't lose her again. The next morning, Richard paced the length of the study, the tension in his body mirroring the restless energy in his mind. The discoveries of the previous day had left him reeling. Samantha's connection to Emily felt undeniable, but there was still a cloud of uncertainty hanging over them. If Samantha truly was his daughter, the child he and Emily had dreamed of raising together, then they needed confirmation, irrefutable proof. Samantha entered the room hesitantly, sensing the weight of Richard's thoughts. She hadn't slept much the night before, her mind racing with possibilities. The photograph of Emily had filled a void in her heart, but it also opened doors to questions she wasn't sure she was ready to confront. "Morning," she said softly, breaking the silence. Richard stopped pacing and turned to her. His expression was grave but kind. "Good morning. I've been thinking." He hesitated, as though carefully choosing his words. "There's a way to get some answers. A DNA test." Samantha's heart skipped a beat. The suggestion was logical, inevitable even, but it still made her stomach churn. "You want to know if I'm your daughter," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Richard replied, his tone steady. "And I know this might feel overwhelming, but it's the only way to be certain." Samantha nodded slowly. "I understand," she said. "I want answers too." Richard gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Thank you." Later that afternoon, a lab technician arrived at the mansion. The process was quick and clinical, a simple swab of the inside of their cheeks. But the weight of what it represented was anything but simple. As the technician left with the samples, Samantha felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension. The results would take a few days, but those days felt like an eternity already. Richard, ever the man of action, threw himself into work to distract himself from the waiting. But even as he pored over spreadsheets and emails, his mind wandered back to Emily, to the life they had built, and the tragedy that had torn it apart. The possibility that Samantha could be their daughter was both exhilarating and terrifying. Samantha, on the other hand, found herself drawn to the garden. She wandered the paths aimlessly, the cool breeze brushing against her skin. Her mind was a jumble of emotions: hope, fear, and a deep longing for clarity. As she reached the stone bench beneath the oak tree, she sat down and pulled the violin case onto her lap. Opening it, she ran her fingers over the instrument. As if seeking comfort from the one constant in her life, she began to play, letting the familiar melody flow through her fingers. The music filled the garden, carrying her emotions in every note. From the study, Richard heard the music drift through the open window. He stood and walked to the window, watching Samantha as she played. The sight of her, so absorbed in the melody, brought a lump to his throat. It was like seeing Emily again, a ghost of the past brought to life. The days stretched on, each one feeling longer than the last. Richard and Samantha fell into an unspoken routine, keeping their distance as they processed their emotions in their own ways. Samantha spent most of her time in the garden or the library, while Richard divided his time between work and revisiting old memories. On the evening of the third day, a courier arrived at the mansion with an envelope. Richard's hands trembled as he accepted it, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He turned to Samantha, who had just entered the foyer, her expression mirroring his apprehension. "This is it," he said, holding up the envelope. Samantha nodded, her heart pounding. "Let's open it together." They moved to the study, the envelope resting on the desk between them. Richard took a deep breath before carefully tearing it open. The sound of the paper ripping seemed deafening in the silence. He unfolded the document inside, his eyes scanning the words. Time seemed to slow as he read the results. Finally, he looked up at Samantha, his expression a mixture of shock and awe. "It's a match," he said, his voice trembling. "You're my daughter." The words hit Samantha like a wave, overwhelming her with emotion. Tears welled up in her eyes as she tried to process what they meant. All her life, she had wondered about her parents, about where she came from. Now, she had an answer, a father who had been searching for her, even if neither of them had known it. Richard reached across the desk, taking her hands in his. "Samantha," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you have no idea how much this means to me, after all these years. To know you're here, that you're safe, it's more than I could have ever hoped for." Samantha nodded, her voice shaking as she replied, "I never thought I'd find a family, and now, I have you." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their discovery settling over them. It was a bittersweet moment, one filled with joy at their connection, but also a lingering sorrow for the years they had lost. As night fell, Richard stood at the window of his study, gazing out at the stars. He thought of Emily, of the love they had shared, and of the daughter they had unknowingly found again. But the reunion wasn't complete. Somewhere out there, Emily was still waiting, and now, more than ever, Richard was determined to bring her home. The mansion felt different now. The weight of the DNA test results had settled over the house like a fragile but undeniable truth. Samantha was Richard's daughter. The air was filled with an unspoken understanding, yet the emotions that swirled between them were complex, equal parts joy, sorrow, and disbelief. Samantha sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. Her mind raced with questions. What did this mean for her now? How did she fit into a life she had no memory of? And most of all, what had truly happened to Emily, her mother? Across the mansion, Richard stood in the study, staring at the violin on his desk. It had been the thread connecting them, the one clue that had led him to Samantha. But now that he knew the truth, the questions surrounding Emily burned even brighter. If she had survived the crash, why hadn't she returned? Why had she left Samantha behind? The sharp ring of the doorbell shattered the silence. Richard hurried to answer it, finding Detective Collins on the doorstep, holding a folder and wearing the same serious expression he always seemed to carry. "I've got something," Collins said without preamble. Stepping inside, Richard led him to the study, where they sat across from each other. Collins placed the folder on the desk and opened it, revealing a series of documents and photographs. "I followed up on the lead in Vermont," Collins began. "There was a small town where a woman matching Emily's description was seen shortly after the hospital incident. The records are thin, but I managed to track down a name, Emily Thompson, or someone using her name. Stayed in a boarding house there for a few weeks." Richard's breath caught. "She was alive," he said, his voice barely audible. Collins nodded. "But that's not all. After leaving Vermont, she seems to have disappeared again. Until recently." Richard's heart raced. "What do you mean?" Collins pulled out a grainy photograph taken at what looked like a park. It showed a woman with soft, familiar features sitting on a bench, her hands folded in her lap. She appeared older, with streaks of gray in her hair, but there was no mistaking her. "It's her," Richard whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Where is this?" "Nashville," Collins said. "She's been living there under the radar. I think she believes you and Samantha are gone." The words hit Richard like a punch to the gut. He clenched his fists, trying to steady himself. The idea that Emily had been alive all these years, believing she was alone, was almost too much to bear. "We have to go to her," he said firmly. "I need to see her." Collins nodded. "I've already started making arrangements, but you should prepare yourself, Richard. This won't be easy, for you or for her." Meanwhile, Samantha lingered near the door of the study, having overheard fragments of the conversation. The mention of her mother being alive sent a wave of emotions crashing over her. For years, she had dreamed of finding her family, and now, piece by piece, it was happening. But the reality was far more complicated than she had imagined. When Richard emerged from the study, he found her standing in the hallway, her eyes wide with anticipation and fear. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You found her?" Richard nodded, his expression softening. "Yes, she's in Nashville." Samantha felt tears welling up in her eyes. "We have to go. We have to see her." "We will," Richard said, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "But I need you to be prepared, Samantha. This won't be simple. We don't know what state she's in or how she'll react to seeing us." Samantha nodded, her determination outweighing her fear. "I don't care. I need to see her." Over the next day, arrangements were made. Collins coordinated the logistics, while Richard and Samantha tried to prepare themselves for what lay ahead. Neither of them could focus on anything else. The anticipation was electric, but so was the anxiety. On the evening before their departure, Samantha found herself in the garden once again, the violin resting on her lap. She played the melody softly, letting it echo through the quiet night. This time, it felt different. Not just a song, but a bridge between her past and present. Richard watched from a distance, his heart heavy with both hope and dread. The image of Emily's face in the photograph haunted him, and he couldn't shake the thought of how much time had been lost. "Samantha," he called gently. Walking toward her, she lowered the violin and looked up at him. "Do you think she'll recognize me?" she asked. Richard hesitated, then sat beside her on the stone bench. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know she'll feel it, just like I did when I heard you play." Samantha nodded, a faint smile crossing her lips. "I hope so." The next morning, as the sun rose over the mansion, Richard and Samantha stood by the front door, their bags packed. Collins arrived shortly after, ready to accompany them on their journey. As they climbed into the car, Richard looked back at the mansion one last time. For years, it had been a place of sorrow and emptiness, but now, it held the promise of a reunion, a chance to reclaim what had been lost. As the car pulled away, Samantha glanced at Richard, her heart pounding with anticipation. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in her life, she felt like she was moving toward something real, something she had been searching for all along. The drive to Nashville was long and filled with a heavy silence. Samantha sat in the passenger seat, her fingers nervously fidgeting with the strap of her bag. Beside her, Richard kept his eyes on the road, his expression tense and unreadable. Detective Collins followed in a separate car, keeping a discreet distance as agreed. Neither Richard nor Samantha had spoken much since they left the mansion. The weight of their shared journey loomed over them, both of them lost in their own thoughts. For Richard, the prospect of seeing Emily again was almost too overwhelming to process. He had spent 20 years grieving her, only to find out she had been alive all along. What would he even say to her? Would she forgive him for not finding her sooner? For Samantha, it was a mix of fear and excitement. She had grown up with a void in her heart, where her family should have been. And now, she was on the verge of meeting the woman who had given her life. But what if Emily didn't recognize her? What if she didn't want to be found? The hum of the car engine was the only sound as they crossed state lines. Samantha glanced out the window, watching the scenery blur into a patchwork of highways, fields, and small towns. Each mile brought them closer to the truth. Yet the closer they got, the more uncertain she felt. Finally, as the skyline of Nashville came into view, Richard broke the silence. "We're almost there," he said, his voice low. Samantha nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Do you think she'll know it's us?" Richard hesitated before answering. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I have to believe she'll feel it. Just like I felt it with you." They arrived at a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, the streets lined with small houses and leafy trees. Collins had provided them with an address, a quiet residence near a local park. Richard parked the car a short distance away, his hands gripping the steering wheel as he stared at the house. "That's it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Samantha followed his gaze, her heart pounding. The house was unremarkable, with a small porch and a neatly trimmed lawn. But to her, it felt like the most important place in the world. Collins approached their car, giving them a quick nod. "I've spoken to some of the neighbors," he said. "She keeps to herself, doesn't have many visitors. I don't think she'll expect this." Richard nodded, taking a deep breath. "Let's do this." Samantha hesitated as they stepped out of the car, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. She clutched Richard's arm for support, and he gave her a reassuring squeeze. Together, they approached the house, each step feeling heavier than the last. When they reached the door, Richard paused, his hand hovering over the doorbell. For a moment, he considered turning back, the weight of the moment threatening to crush him. But then he looked at Samantha, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope, and he found the strength to press the button. The chime echoed inside the house, and they waited in tense silence. A few moments later, the door opened slightly, and a woman's face appeared. Richard's breath caught. It was her. Emily. She looked older, her features softened by time, but her eyes were unmistakable. Those same kind, soulful eyes he had fallen in love with so many years ago. For a moment she stared at them, confusion flickering across her face. "Emily," Richard said, his voice trembling. "It's me." Her eyes widened, and she opened the door a little further. "Richard," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's been a long time," he said, tears pooling in his eyes. Emily's gaze shifted to Samantha, her expression turning to one of cautious curiosity. "Who is she?" Richard stepped aside, placing a gentle hand on Samantha's shoulder. "This is Samantha," he said. "Our daughter." The words hung in the air like a revelation, and Emily's hand flew to her mouth. Tears welled up in her eyes as she stared at Samantha, her emotions a chaotic mix of disbelief, recognition, and overwhelming love. "Samantha," Emily whispered, her voice breaking. "It can't be. It's me," Samantha said softly, her own tears spilling over. "I've been looking for you. We both have." Emily stepped back, opening the door fully. Her legs wobbled, and she leaned against the doorway for support. "Come in," she said, her voice shaking. Inside, the house was modest but warm, filled with small touches that spoke of a quiet life. Photographs lined the mantel, landscapes, flowers, and moments of solitude, but no faces. Emily gestured for them to sit, her hands trembling as she poured tea for everyone. For a long moment, no one spoke, the silence filled only by the ticking of a small clock on the wall. Finally, Emily broke the tension. "I thought you were both gone," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "After the accident, I thought I'd lost everything." Richard reached for her hand, his own shaking. "We thought we lost you," he said. "For 20 years I searched, and then Samantha appeared, and everything started to make sense again." Emily turned to Samantha, her eyes brimming with tears. "I never stopped thinking about you," she said. "Not for a single day." Samantha leaned forward, her voice trembling. "I don't remember much, but I always felt like something was missing. Now I know what it was." The three of them sat together, the weight of 20 years slowly lifting as they shared their stories. It wasn't easy, and there were still unanswered questions, but for the first time, they were together, a family piecing itself back together, one moment at a time. The tea Emily had poured sat untouched on the small table in her modest living room. The tension in the air was palpable as Richard, Emily, and Samantha sat in a triangle of emotions: hope, disbelief, and the weight of everything unsaid. Richard was the first to speak, his voice unsteady but determined. "Emily, we need to understand what happened that night. Why didn't you come back?" Emily lowered her gaze, her hands trembling as she clutched the hem of her sweater. "I thought you were gone," she said quietly, her voice cracked as she continued. "When I woke up after the accident, everything was chaos. I searched for you, but they told me you didn't make it." Richard's breath caught. "They told you I was dead." Emily nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I was taken to a small clinic by a woman who found me on the side of the road. I was in and out of consciousness, And when I asked about you and Samantha, they said the worst. I was devastated. I didn't even know Samantha had survived." Samantha's heart clenched at her mother's words. "But you didn't come back to New York," she said softly. "Why?" Emily wiped her tears, her hands trembling. "I couldn't face it," she admitted. "The house, the memories, everything reminded me of what I'd lost. And then, when I finally found the strength to leave the clinic, I realized I had nothing. I didn't know where to go. I wandered, hoping to forget, but I never could." Richard leaned forward, his voice filled with both pain and urgency. "Emily, Samantha was found at a hospital in Chicago just days after the accident. Did you leave her there?" Emily's eyes widened, and she shook her head vehemently. "No, I would never have done that. I thought she was gone. Just like you." Samantha's brow furrowed. "Then how did I end up there? Who took me to the hospital?" Emily's face grew pale as she reached back into her fragmented memories. "There was a woman," she murmured. "The same one who brought me to the clinic. She said she found me near the wreckage, but I don't remember much else. She might have been the one who took you to the hospital." Richard and Samantha exchanged a glance, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to shift, but still refusing to fit. Collins, who had remained respectfully silent until now, cleared his throat. "If this woman was involved, we need to find her. She might hold the key to understanding what really happened that night." Emily nodded, her resolve hardening. "I want to help. I'll do whatever it takes to bring the truth to light." The detective pulled out his notepad, jotting down details as Emily recounted everything she could remember about the mysterious woman. "She was in her 50s, I think. Short hair, gray with some brown still in it. She said her name was Ruth." Collins nodded. "That's a start. I'll see what I can dig up." As he left the house to make some calls, Richard turned back to Emily, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. "I can't believe you were out there all this time," he said. "I never stopped looking for you." Emily reached for his hand, her touch familiar despite the years that had passed. "And I never stopped thinking of you," she said. "But I was lost. Richard, I was so lost." Samantha watched the exchange, her emotions swirling. Seeing her parents reconnect was both beautiful and bittersweet. She had dreamed of moments like this, but the pain they all carried was undeniable. Later that evening, as the sun set over Nashville, the three of them sat together on Emily's porch. The air was cool, and the soft chirping of crickets filled the silence. Emily turned to Samantha, her expression tender. "You've grown into such a remarkable young woman," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I wish I could have been there for you." Samantha's throat tightened. "I wish you had been too," she admitted. "But I understand now. You thought you were doing what was best." Emily reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "I hope I can make it up to you. To both of you." Richard placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We'll figure it out together," he said. "We've already lost too much time." As the stars began to appear in the night sky, Collins returned with a determined look on his face. "I've got something," he said. "There's a woman named Ruth Daniels who matches the description. She used to work as a nurse in a small clinic near the accident site. It looks like she moved out of state shortly after the accident, but I've got an address for her in Georgia." Emily's breath hitched. "She's still alive." Collins nodded. "It seems so. If anyone knows what happened that night, it's her." Richard stood, his resolve firm. "Then we go to Georgia. We need to know the truth." Samantha glanced at Emily, who nodded in agreement. The fear and hesitation that had once clouded her expression were gone, replaced by determination. As they prepared for the next leg of their journey, the weight of the past began to shift. They were no longer just searching for answers. They were confronting the pain, loss, and uncertainty that had defined their lives for so long. Together, they stepped forward, ready to uncover the truth and finally close the chapter that had haunted them for 2 decades. The following morning, the sun rose over Nashville with a soft golden glow, as if the city itself were holding its breath for what was to come. Inside Emily's modest home, Samantha sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. Across from her, Emily watched her daughter intently, as though trying to memorize every detail of her face. Richard stood by the window, looking out at the quiet street. His mind was preoccupied with thoughts of Ruth Daniels, the nurse who might finally provide the missing pieces to their fractured history. But before heading to Georgia, he knew there was still unfinished business here in Nashville, years of separation and grief that needed to be acknowledged. Emily broke the silence first. "I still can't believe you're here," she said, her voice trembling. "Both of you, after all this time." Samantha managed a small smile. "I've felt the same way since I arrived at the mansion," she said. "It's been overwhelming, but it feels like I found something I didn't even know I was missing." Richard turned back to face them, his expression softening. "We've all lost so much," he said, "but we've been given this chance, and I don't want to waste it." Emily nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "Neither do I." They spent the morning sharing stories, piecing together the fragments of their lives that had been lost to time. Emily told Samantha about her love of music, and how the melody Samantha had played was something she had written during one of the happiest periods of her life. "It's strange," Samantha said, her voice thoughtful. "I've always known that melody. I played it without ever questioning where it came from. It's like it was always inside me." Emily reached across the table, taking Samantha's hand. "It was," she said with a bittersweet smile. "I used to play it for you when you were just a baby. I'd hold you close and hum the tune to help you fall asleep. I never imagined it would stay with you all these years." Richard watched the exchange, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and sorrow. Seeing Emily and Samantha together was a dream come true, but it also underscored the years they had lost. He vowed silently to make the most of the time they had now. By mid-afternoon, Detective Collins arrived at the house, his arrival punctuated by the sharp knock at the door. Richard opened it to find the detective holding a manila folder, his expression as serious as ever. "Got some more information on Ruth Daniels," Collins said. Stepping inside, "She worked at the clinic where Emily was taken after the accident, but it seems she left shortly after. I managed to find an old colleague of hers who said Ruth had a habit of taking in strays. People, animals, even kids who had nowhere else to go. If anyone knows how Samantha ended up at that hospital." "It's her." Emily nodded, her resolve clear. "Then we need to find her." "I've already booked us rooms in Georgia," Richard said, glancing at Samantha and Emily. "We can leave tomorrow morning." The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparations and quiet moments. Emily showed Samantha old keepsakes she had held onto over the years, including a small locket with a picture of Richard inside. "I couldn't bear to part with it," she said softly. Samantha, in turn, shared stories of her time at the orphanage, her struggles and triumphs, and how the violin had been her lifeline through it all that evening as the three of them sat together in the living room. Richard brought out the photograph Collins had shown him, the grainy image of Emily sitting in the park. He handed it to her, watching as she studied it with a faraway look in her eyes. "I was so lost back then," she said quietly. "I spent years moving from place to place, trying to escape the pain. I thought I was doing the right thing by disappearing, but now I see how wrong I was." Richard placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We've all made mistakes," he said, "but we're here now, and that's what matters." Samantha nodded, her voice steady. "We have a chance to start over, to be a family." The words hung in the air, a promise and a challenge all at once. As night fell, Samantha found herself once again drawn to the violin. She played softly in the corner of the living room, the melody weaving its way through the quiet house. Richard and Emily sat together on the couch, listening with a mixture of awe and gratitude. "It's like hearing you all over again," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. Emily leaned her head against his shoulder, her eyes glistening with tears. "It's like coming home," she whispered. For the first time in decades, the house felt whole. The pain of the past hadn't disappeared, but it no longer defined them. They were a family, fractured but healing, and for the first time, there was hope for the future. The journey to Georgia was quieter than the trip to Nashville. Samantha sat in the back seat this time, giving Emily and Richard the space to sit together in the front. She watched as they spoke softly to each other, their words lost in the hum of the road. There was an ease between them that hadn't been there before, a tentative warmth that hinted at the bond they once shared. Samantha's heart swelled as she watched them. This was what she had always imagined having, a family, though the circumstances were far from perfect. The three of them were slowly finding their way back to one another, piece by piece. The car pulled into the driveway of a small roadside motel just after dusk. The neon sign flickered faintly, casting a soft glow over the gravel parking lot. Detective Collins was already there, leaning against his car with a folder in hand. "You made good time," he said, straightening up as they got out of the car. Richard nodded. "Did you find anything else?" Collins gestured for them to follow him inside. In the dimly lit motel room, he spread the contents of the folder across the small table. "Ruth Daniels lived in a rural area just outside of Macon," he began. "She worked at the clinic for several years before moving to a small farm where she's lived ever since. If she was involved in taking Samantha to the hospital, she might still remember." Emily glanced at the grainy black and white photograph of Ruth that Collins had included in his research. The woman in the picture had kind eyes and a no-nonsense expression, the kind of person who seemed both reliable and unyielding. "We should go first thing in the morning," Emily said, her voice firm. Collins nodded. "She's expecting us. I managed to contact her through an old colleague, and she's willing to talk." That night, as the others slept, Samantha found herself sitting outside the motel under the vast expanse of the night sky. The stars above were bright and unrelenting, a stark contrast to the quiet chaos in her heart. Emily joined her a few moments later, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders to guard against the chill. "Can't sleep?" she asked gently. Samantha shook her head. "Too much on my mind." Emily sat beside her, the silence between them comfortable but heavy with unspoken words. After a moment, Samantha turned to her. "Did you ever think this would happen? That we'd find each other?" Emily smiled faintly, her eyes misty. "Not in my wildest dreams," she admitted. "For years I thought I had lost everything. And then, when I saw you and Richard at my door, it felt like a miracle." Samantha looked down at her hands. "I always wondered about my parents," she said softly, "but I never thought I'd actually meet you. Now that I have, it feels surreal." Emily reached over, placing a hand on Samantha's. "You've been so strong, Samantha," she said. "Stronger than I could have ever imagined. I'm so proud of you." The words struck a chord deep within Samantha, and she felt tears welling in her eyes. She had spent so much of her life feeling lost and alone, and now, sitting here with her mother, she felt a warmth she hadn't known she was missing. The next morning, the group set off early, the soft light of dawn casting long shadows over the road. As they approached Ruth's farm, a sense of anticipation filled the air. The property was quaint and well kept, with a small white house surrounded by fields that stretched toward the horizon. Ruth herself greeted them at the door, her sharp eyes scanning each of them before settling on Emily. "You must be the one looking for answers," she said, her voice steady but kind. Emily nodded. "Yes, thank you for agreeing to see us." Ruth ushered them inside, leading them to a cozy living room filled with mismatched furniture and the faint scent of lavender. She settled into a worn armchair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I remember the night of the accident," Ruth began, her voice heavy with the weight of memory. "It was pouring rain, and I was driving home from a late shift at the clinic. That's when I saw it. The wreck on the side of the road." Richard leaned forward, his heart pounding. "You found Emily there?" Ruth nodded. "She was unconscious, barely breathing. I pulled her from the car and drove her to the clinic myself, but there was a baby too." Samantha's breath caught, and she gripped the edge of her chair. "I found her in the back seat," Ruth continued. "She was crying, but she seemed unharmed. I didn't know what else to do, so I brought her to the hospital in Chicago the next day. I thought it was the safest place for her." Emily covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes brimming with tears. "You saved her," she whispered. Ruth's expression softened. "I only did what I thought was right," she said. "I didn't know how to find her family, and by the time I went back to the clinic to check on you, you were gone." Richard and Emily exchanged a glance, the weight of Ruth's story settling over them like a heavy blanket. Samantha's voice was quiet but steady. "Thank you," she said, "for keeping me safe." Ruth smiled faintly, her eyes shining with emotion. "You're welcome, child. I'm just glad you found your way back to where you belong." As they left the farm, the pieces of the puzzle finally began to align. Ruth's story filled the gaps in their history, bringing clarity to years of uncertainty. Though the pain of the past still lingered, there was a sense of closure that none of them had expected. For the first time, they could see a path forward, a chance to rebuild what had been lost and create something new. The drive back from Ruth's farm was quiet, each of them lost in their thoughts. Ruth's story had filled in many of the blanks, but it also stirred new emotions: gratitude, relief, and a lingering sorrow for the time lost. For Richard, Emily, and Samantha, the revelation was both a gift and a reminder of how fragile their connection had been all along. As the car pulled into the driveway of their motel, Samantha glanced at her parents, their faces etched with exhaustion. Though the truth had finally emerged, the weight of 20 years apart wasn't something that could be resolved in a single conversation, or even a single journey that evening. They gathered in Emily's motel room. The air was heavy with the unspoken, each of them struggling to find the right words to address the complexity of their reunion. Samantha sat cross-legged on the bed, her fingers tracing the edge of her violin case, while Richard and Emily sat side by side on the small sofa. "I thought knowing the truth would make everything feel complete," Samantha said finally, her voice quiet. "But it doesn't. It just makes me realize how much we've missed." Emily's expression softened, and she reached for Samantha's hand. "I feel the same way," she admitted. "I look at you, and I see the life I could have had with you. It breaks my heart to think of all the moments I missed. Your first steps, your first words, every birthday. I can never get that back." Richard nodded, his voice heavy with regret. "None of us can," he said, "but we have a choice now. We can dwell on what we've lost, or we can focus on what we've found." Samantha looked between them, her heart aching with a mixture of love and frustration. "It's not that simple," she said. "I don't even know who I am in all of this. I grew up thinking I was no one, and now suddenly I have a family, a past I don't remember, and a mother and father I barely know." Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded in understanding. "You're right," she said. "It's not simple, and I know it will take time. For all of us." Richard reached for Emily's hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. "We've already come this far," he said. "We'll figure out the rest together." The next morning, they left the motel and began the drive back to Nashville. The road stretched ahead of them like a metaphor for their journey, long, uncertain, but filled with the promise of moving forward. Samantha sat in the back seat, watching her parents talk quietly in the front. Their connection was undeniable, but it was clear that the years apart had left scars that wouldn't heal overnight. As they approached Emily's neighborhood, Samantha broke the silence. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice hesitant. Richard glanced at her through the rearview mirror. "What do you mean?" Samantha shrugged, her eyes fixed on the passing houses. "I mean, do we all just go back to our separate lives? Do we stay together? What does being a family even look like for us now?" Emily turned in her seat to face her. "I don't have all the answers," she admitted, "but I know I don't want to lose you again, whatever it takes. I want to be a part of your life." Samantha nodded, her chest tightening. "I want that too. I just don't know how." They arrived at Emily's house as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the neighborhood in a warm, golden light. Inside, the three of them settled into the living room, the same space where they had first reunited, but this time, the atmosphere was different. There was no longer the weight of uncertainty hanging over them, only the daunting task of figuring out how to move forward. As night fell, Richard stepped outside to call Collins and update him on their plans. Emily and Samantha remained in the living room, the quiet between them growing heavier by the moment. Finally, Samantha spoke. "Do you ever wish things had been different?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Emily's eyes filled with tears as she turned to her daughter. "Every single day," she said. "I wish I could have held you, watched you grow up, been there for you when you needed me, but wishing won't change the past. All I can do now is try to make up for the time we've lost." Samantha nodded, her throat tightening. "I guess I'm scared," she admitted. "What if I don't know how to be a daughter? What if I don't live up to what you hoped for?" Emily crossed the room and knelt in front of her, taking her hands. "Samantha," she said firmly, "you're everything I could have hoped for and more. The fact that you're here, that we found each other, is more than I ever dreamed. We'll figure this out together." As Richard returned, he found the two of them sitting close, their hands intertwined. He smiled softly at the sight, a sense of peace washing over him, despite the challenges that lay ahead that night as they prepared for bed. The house felt different. It was still filled with the echoes of the past, but there was also a new energy, one of hope, resilience, and the promise of a future built on their rediscovered connection. The first rays of dawn filtered through Emily's living room windows, casting a soft glow over the house. Samantha was the first to wake, her mind already buzzing with thoughts of the previous days. She moved quietly to the kitchen, her hands busy brewing a pot of coffee while her heart remained heavy with unspoken emotions. The scent of freshly brewed coffee drew Richard into the room. He found Samantha staring out the window, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug. For a moment, he simply watched her, taking in the quiet strength she carried. Finally, he cleared his throat softly, breaking the silence. "Couldn't sleep either?" he asked. Samantha glanced at him and shook her head. "Too much to think about," she admitted. "It's hard to wrap my head around all of this. Finding out you're my dad, meeting my mom. It's like my whole life is being rewritten." Richard nodded, pouring himself a cup of coffee and leaning against the counter. "I know it's a lot," he said, "but I want you to know something, Samantha. No matter how overwhelming this feels, you don't have to face it alone." Samantha smiled faintly, his words providing a small measure of comfort. "Thanks," she said. "It's just, I spent so long thinking I didn't have anyone. Now, suddenly, I have both of you, and I don't know how to be a part of this." Richard walked over and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to figure it all out right away," he said. "We'll take it one step at a time. The important thing is that we're here now." Emily joined them not long after, her expression softening as she saw them together. "Good morning," she said, her voice still tinged with sleep. "Morning," Samantha and Richard replied in unison, sharing a small smile as they sat together in the kitchen, sipping coffee and talking about the day ahead. The atmosphere began to shift. The tension of the past days started to ease, replaced by a sense of tentative normalcy. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Later that morning, Emily suggested a walk in the nearby park. The idea of getting out of the house and enjoying the fresh air appealed to everyone, and soon they were strolling along a tree-lined path, the sounds of birds and rustling leaves filling the quiet spaces between their conversations. As they walked, Richard and Emily fell into step beside each other, their hands occasionally brushing. Samantha trailed a few steps behind, observing them with a mix of curiosity and warmth. It was clear that despite everything, the bond between her parents had not been entirely lost. At one point, they stopped at a small bench overlooking a pond. Richard sat beside Emily, their shoulders touching as they watched the water ripple in the breeze. Samantha sat on the grass nearby, absently picking at the blades as she listened to their conversation. "Do you ever think about what could have been?" Emily asked softly, her gaze fixed on the pond. "Every day," Richard replied. "Richard, I've spent years wondering what life would be like if that night had never happened. If we hadn't been separated." Emily nodded, her voice tinged with regret. "I've thought about it too. But now that we're here, I realize it's not about what we've lost. It's about what we still have." Richard turned to her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "You're right. We've been given a second chance, and I don't want to waste it." Samantha listened quietly, their words resonating deeply. For so long, she had felt disconnected, as though she were drifting through life without an anchor. But now, sitting here with them, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. That evening, back at the house, Samantha found herself drawn to the violin once again. She played softly in the corner of the living room, her parents sitting nearby and listening with rapt attention. The melody, so deeply ingrained in their shared history, seemed to weave them together in ways words could not. When she finished, Emily wiped a tear from her cheek and smiled. "You play beautifully," she said. "It's like hearing a piece of my heart." Samantha set the violin down and joined them on the couch. "It's always been my connection to something," she said. "I didn't know what it was before, but now I think it was you." Emily reached for Samantha's hand, holding it tightly. "And now we know," she said. "We're connected, and we always will be." Richard placed a hand on both of theirs, his voice filled with emotion. "No matter what comes next, we're a family, and nothing can change that." As the night deepened, the three of them sat together, sharing stories, laughter, and dreams for the future. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they were ready to face it together. For the first time in years, the house felt like a home. The morning air was crisp as sunlight streamed through the windows of Emily's house. Samantha stood by the kitchen counter, pouring herself a cup of coffee and savoring the warmth in her hands. Today felt different. A mixture of finality and possibility hung in the air. It was the beginning of something new. Emily entered the room, her hair falling loosely over her shoulders, a soft smile lighting up her face. "Good morning," she said, her voice gentle. "Morning," Samantha replied, glancing over at her mother. She still wasn't used to saying the word, but it felt right. Natural, even. Richard appeared moments later, carrying a stack of papers. He placed them on the table with a satisfied expression. "I've been thinking about next steps," he said, his tone resolute. "We've come so far, but there's still so much to rebuild." Emily glanced at the papers, her brow furrowing slightly. "What are those?" she asked. "Property documents," Richard explained. "I've been holding onto the mansion for years, waiting for the right time to decide what to do with it. Now, I think it's clear. It's not just a house. It's our home, and I want both of you to share it with me." Samantha froze, her coffee halfway to her lips. The thought of leaving behind everything she had known, her independence, her routines, was daunting, but at the same time, the idea of building a life with her parents, of having a place where she truly belonged, was equally tempting. "You want us to move in with you?" Emily asked, her voice tinged with both surprise and warmth. Richard nodded. "I know it won't be easy, and I'm not expecting everything to fall into place overnight, but I want us to have a chance to be a family, to make new memories together." Emily's eyes glistened as she reached for Richard's hand. "I'd like that," she said softly. "I think it's time we stop running from the past and start building a future." Samantha set her mug down, her heart pounding. "I don't know," she admitted. "It's a big change. I've spent my whole life being on my own. I don't even know if I know how to be part of something like this." Emily turned to her, her expression filled with understanding. "You don't have to decide right away," she said. "But whatever you choose, know that we're here for you. Always." Samantha nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Thanks," she said. "That means a lot." The rest of the day was spent making plans. Richard called Detective Collins to thank him for his help, and to let him know they wouldn't be pursuing further investigations for now. "We have what we need," Richard said over the phone. "It's time to focus on the present." Emily began sorting through her belongings, deciding what to keep and what to leave behind. Samantha helped her, the process becoming a bonding experience, as they shared stories and laughter over forgotten keepsakes. By evening, they were all gathered in the living room, the violin resting on Samantha's lap. Richard had brought out an old photo album from the mansion, its pages filled with snapshots of their lives before the accident. Emily flipped through the pictures, her fingers lingering on each image as if trying to preserve the memories. "This was our anniversary," she said, pointing to a photo of her and Richard standing in front of the mansion's garden. "We spent the whole day planting roses, and then it rained," Richard added with a chuckle. "We were drenched by the time we finished." Samantha smiled as she listened, her heart warming at the glimpses of the life they had shared. For the first time, she felt like she was part of those memories, even if she hadn't been there to experience them. Later that night, as the house grew quiet, Samantha stepped outside to the porch. The stars above were bright, their light reflecting in her eyes as she gazed up at the sky. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, the loneliness, the uncertainty, and now, the unexpected reunion that had changed everything. Emily joined her after a few minutes, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "Penny for your thoughts?" she asked, her voice soft. Samantha sighed, her breath visible in the cool air. "I'm scared," she admitted, "but I'm also excited. For the first time, I feel like I have something to look forward to." Emily smiled, pulling her daughter into a warm embrace. "We'll figure it out," she said. Together. Inside, Richard watched them from the window, his heart swelling with gratitude. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but he knew they would face it as a family, a bond strengthened by the trials they had overcome. As the night deepened, the three of them sat together in the living room, sharing stories and dreams for the future. The violin's melody filled the air once more, not as a memory of the past, but as a song of hope for the days to come. For the first time in 20 years, the pieces of their lives had come together. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs, a new beginning for a family that had been lost and found again.